During the American Civil War, mortars were a primary weapon of choice since these weapons could be hidden out of sight, lobbing shells onto their target that are hidden behind natural landscapes or man-built fortifications. These weapons came in all types of shapes and sizes, which meant they were also perfect for being used in naval engagements once they were placed in a special built barge. These could be towed out to a river, put in a stable position, and they would lob shells on land targets from the water. Out of all of the mortars that were serviced during the Civil War, one in particular became famous for its efforts, and this became known as the Dictator. Dictator was an example of a monstrous weapon for its time period, actually being a part of the largest mortars serviced during the war. Now, normally when discussing a weapon like Dictator, you could normally outright call it the largest mortar fielded during the Civil War, but this is not exactly true, as Dictator is one out of many mortars of its type, since it is a 13-inch Seacoast mortar model 1861. The United States was the only country at the time producing the 13-inch Seacoast mortar. The Confederate States did not have the capabilities to make this weapon, and as far as I can tell, they never captured or at least used one in combat. The United States would only use this weapon for sieging operations, since it was quite poor at anything else. But in regards to being used as a siege artillery, the United States still classed this weapon as largely ineffective, as smaller weapons such as the 10-inch Seacoast mortar or the 8-inch Seacoast mortar were easier to handle and regarded as more effective weapons, meaning the 13-inch was often placed on the back burner. During the siege of Petersburg, Virginia in July 1864, the United States moved a single 13-inch Seacoast mortar to the outskirts of Petersburg, where it would bombard Confederate positions. The Union soldiers would nickname this weapon the Dictator, since it was a sole powerful weapon. When Dictator was moved to the outskirts of Petersburg in July of 1864, it was attached to a specifically built railroad flat car that was reinforced to handle the mass and the recoil of the weapon when it fired, since it would not be demounted for firing, and this flat car would be placed on a spur line which would run around the City Point and Petersburg Railroad so that it could be placed in various firing positions to attack specific targets at any given time. However, the flat car had multiple problems when dealing with Dictator in specific, since Dictator had a mass of 17,120 pounds, and it had a firing charge of 20 pounds maximum, lobbing a 225-pound shell more than 2 miles distance. The problems that would come up with a flat car would not be recognized until firing commenced on July 9, 1864, with the primary target being Chesterfield Battery, which was across the Appomattox River. Company G of the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery Regiment was tasked with bombarding Chesterfield because it was a prominent Confederate artillery post, and direct Union fire seemed to have little to no effect on the Confederate dig-in. This meant that all obstacles could be overcome by lobbing the shell over top, which is where Dictator came in. On July 11th, 2 days after firing commenced, Dictator was firing a few shells once again at Confederate positions when the flat car it was residing on suffered from a structural failure and broke under the recoil of the gun, meaning Dictator could no longer be safely fired from this platform. The artillery regiment was quick to respond, repairing the car using iron rods and iron plates, and adding more of these to reinforce the car even further than what had originally been done, meaning it could now support the Dictator's recoil. July 30th would be one of the most successful and active days for the Dictator during his 3-month campaign. It would fire a total of 19 shells, destroying 1 artillery gun at Chesterfield and killing approximately a dozen men to go with it. As the siege carried on, the Confederates learned how the Dictator was being used, and they were able to counterfire on the weapon, though this fire was ineffective in all instances. Even with the ineffective fire, the Dictator was still vulnerable, so the Union had to move the weapon once again, completely removing it from the rail car and placing it in a permanent fortification on the ground. From here, the Dictator would continue to fire on Confederate lines until September of 1864, where the weapon would be withdrawn from service. By the end of its 3-month bombardment, it fired a total of 218 shells. Following the Battle of Petersburg, the Dictator was moved to the back lines, and the weapon simply disappears. It was most likely either sold off for scrap, or it has been moved to another position and is still on display today, without anybody knowing the true identity of the weapon. The reason for this being tracing these mortars is quite difficult since their manufacture numbers are often worn away or they just simply can't be traced easily. Today, you can visit the permanent ground position that Dictator resided upon in the latter half of its career. In its place resides a replica of the Dictator to exact scale to give an impression of what the gun might have been like in 1864.